There is a specific silence that surrounds certain questions, and after long enough, that silence starts to feel like an answer. Not the silence of ignorance, the silence of something already quietly arranged. The question I keep returning to is simple and direct. Where exactly did the giants go? I am not using that word loosely. I mean the historical record written, mapped and repeated across centuries of people described as extraordinary in stature, inhabiting the vast interior of Eurasia that European cartographers labelled, with remarkable consistency, as Tartaria. That record exists, and then it simply stops. The mainstream explanation is orderly and entirely reasonable. Tartary, or Tartaria, was never a political empire in any formal sense. It was a geographic label applied to the steppe regions of Central and Northern Asia, used loosely by European mapmakers from the 13th century onward to name what they could not fully survey or administer. The peoples described as unusually tall, the Scythians, various Turkic and Mongol groups, semi-nomadic tribes of the inner steppe, were, by this account, simply exaggerated in the retelling. Travellers embellished, distances distorted perception. A people moderately tall became, through layers of translation and time, something approaching the mythological. That explanation is coherent, and I want to be honest about that. It accounts for the majority of what we see in the historical literature. Herodotus wrote about the Scythians in terms that mixed careful observation with mythology, and scholars have spent 2 millennia untangling the two. Embellishment is a documented feature of ancient ethnography. But then you read Antonio Pigafetta, and the orderly explanation develops its first small fracture. Pigafetta was not an ancient traveller working from second-hand reports. He was the official chronicler of Ferdinand Magellan's circumnavigation, sailing in 1520, methodical and writing in real time aboard the fleet. When Magellan's ships anchored in what is now southern Argentina, at a place Magellan named Port San Julián, Pigafetta documented a sustained encounter with local people of extraordinary physical size. He described them as so tall that the Spaniards reached only to their waists. He recorded their diet, their clothing, their expressions. This was not mythology. This was a ship's chronicle, cross-referenced by pilot Francisco Albo, whose navigational log confirms both the anchorage and the contact. The people Pigafetta described were the Tehuelche of Patagonia. Anthropological records confirm they were among the tallest populations documented anywhere in the world at that time. Now hold that fact and notice where you are standing on a map. Magellan was sailing south, moving toward the bottom of the world, and the people he found at the continental edge, at the very threshold of the Southern Ocean, were the tallest documented population in the entire Western Hemisphere. John Byron, Commodore, British naval officer, and grandfather of the poet, completed a circumnavigation beginning in 1764 and documented his own encounters with the Tehuelche in terms remarkably similar to Pigafetta's, despite having no direct access to Pigafetta's then unpublished manuscript. He estimated the people he met at well over 7 feet. He was not a credulous man. 244 years separate Pigafetta's account from Byron's. They were written in different languages, from different cultural frameworks, in service of different colonial powers with no institutional relationship to each other. The consistency of the physical description across that span of time is not by itself conclusive, but it is not nothing. I want to lay out the broader pattern carefully, because this is where it becomes easy to rush ahead of the evidence. The pattern is not dramatic. It is almost boring in its consistency, which is precisely part of why it is difficult to dismiss without serious and sustained attention. Across separate centuries, separate continents, separate languages, the record of anomalously large human populations clusters with notable consistency in one direction, southward. The Scythians occupied the territory that became Tartary on European maps. Their documented migrations moved south and west. The groups that followed them moved along the same general axes. What is harder to account for is how the descriptions change at the edges. The further south and east the record moves, towards Siberia, toward the Mongolian plateau, toward the high-altitude steppe passes bordering the Himalayas, the more persistently the language of extraordinary physical stature appears, not everywhere, but consistently, and always pointing the same direction. The Piri Reis map of 1513 adds another layer, and I want to be careful here because this map has been claimed by too many people for too many purposes. Most of those claims are overreaching, but the map is real. It is held in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul and has been fully authenticated by scholars. What it shows in its southern reaches has been debated for over a century. Some cartographers have argued it represents a rough Antarctic coastline, mapped by implication before the continent's official European discovery in 1820. The mainstream position holds that the southern landmass is a distorted South America or pure Terra Australis speculation. That mainstream explanation is the more likely one, and I accept it as such. But notice what the map does regardless of that debate. It places a significant and detailed southern landmass at the edge of the known world, at a time when European cartography was still struggling to render coastlines. It had actually sailed. And then there is the cartographic tradition surrounding Tartaria itself. From the early maps of Giacomo Gastaldi in the mid-16th century, through Abraham Ortelius and the great Dutch atlases of the 17th century, Tartaria appears as a named, bounded region of enormous extent, larger on many maps than the entirety of Europe combined. The institutional explanation is that European cartographers had poor information about the Asian interior and filled their maps with placeholder labels. That is partially true, but the consistency of the label, its persistence across competing cartographic schools, and its clearly defined boundaries suggests something more than a convenient blank space filler. Now I want to name the strongest counter-argument directly, because it deserves full consideration. The simplest explanation for everything I am describing is that it is not a pattern at all. It is the human mind doing what human minds do, finding shapes in noise, assembling narratives from coincidence, projecting meaning onto scattered distribution. The Tartary giants could be embellishment. The Tehuelche could be a combination of genuine height and fearful perception. The Piri Reis southern coastline could be speculation with no empirical grounding. The southward migration pattern could be ordinary demographic movement, with no extraordinary explanation. I have held all of this. I hold it still. What I have spent a long time trying to identify is where the rational explanation shifts from provisional to genuinely inadequate. That point is not located in any single piece of evidence. It is in something more diffuse, in the texture of which questions get treated as permanently closed and which ones are left open with real rigor. Consider what happened to the Tehuelche in the academic literature. Their average height, which early colonial records consistently place well above European norms, was revised downward in successive anthropological treatments through the 19th and 20th centuries, not dramatically, incrementally, in a direction that is always locally defensible, improved methodology, corrected for observer bias. I understand those corrections. I accept that early colonial height estimates were often impressionistic. What I find difficult is the consistent direction of the revision. Every adjustment goes down. none of them go up. In any domain, a series of corrections that all point the same way eventually stops looking like correction and starts looking like something else. Pigafetta's Chronicle of the Tehuelche generated enormous interest in Europe when it circulated in the 16th century. The descriptions of giant inhabitants of Patagonia became a staple of European geographical writing for over 200 years, and then gradually the interest cooled, not because the accounts were formally disproven, but because they became inconvenient for an emerging scientific framework. Here is the coordination problem, as I understand it. If you were trying to suppress a historical record of this kind, to systematically erase a population from the documented past, you would need to coordinate silence across institutions that had no reason to cooperate. You would need Byzantine, Ottoman, Spanish, Dutch, and British sources to independently arrive at the same omission. No single conspirator could arrange that. No cabal could sustain it across 5 centuries and a dozen competing empires. The institutions that documented Tartaria were rivals. The institutions that recorded Magellan's voyage had no relationship to the cartographers who produced the Piri Reis map. There is no plausible mechanism for active, organized suppression at this scale, which is exactly why the more uncomfortable explanation is not conspiracy. It is something quieter. Shared institutional interest in a particular model of human history, once that model is established, causes the model to defend itself without any coordination at all. The silence does not need an architect. It needs only a professional culture. It needs only a culture that has learned, collectively and without any explicit agreement, which questions are serious ones and which are not, and has decided that this particular question belongs firmly in the second category. Journals do not fund challenges to settled categories. Careers are not built on reopening questions that were declared resolved 2 generations ago. What happened to the label Tartaria itself is instructive here. It persisted on Western European maps with remarkable consistency from Mercator through Blay and Ortelius, and then vanished from cartographic production within a single generation in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. That transition coincides precisely with the period of Russian imperial expansion into the Central Asian interior, when the Russian Empire physically moved through the region labelled Tartaria. The label disappeared from Western maps, not gradually, through the organic drift of usage, but in a traceable and specific transition. Other geographic labels of comparable age, Persia, the Levant, survived into contemporary usage. Tartaria did not. That asymmetry has never been examined with any real seriousness. When Operation Highjump launched in 1946, Admiral Richard Byrd's massive US Navy Antarctic expedition, the largest the continent had ever seen, the stated purpose was scientific research and the establishment of research bases. 13 ships, 23 aircraft, approximately 4,700 military personnel, for a scientific survey of uninhabited ice. Byrd was a decorated polar explorer with legitimate credentials and a serious documented history of Antarctic work. I am not suggesting he was concealing a lost civilization. I am noting that the scale of the operation has never been fully explained by the scientific rationale given for it, and the expedition concluded months before its planned endpoint. Byrd wrote extensively about Antarctica for National Geographic in the years following Highjump. His public language consistently emphasized the continent's strategic importance in ways that exceeded the scientific framing of the official expedition record. He was not a man inclined to vague speculation. The gap between his language and the expedition's official framing is documented and readable by anyone who looks. The International Geophysical Year of 1957 brought 12 nations into coordinated Antarctic research, including nations in active Cold War hostility with one another. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959 established the continent as a demilitarized scientific preserve, suspending all territorial claims indefinitely. That is a remarkable degree of cooperation for an era defined specifically by its absence. I am not saying the treaty conceals something. I am saying that when competing superpowers agree to restrict access to an entire continent and the explanation offered is simply scientific preservation, the explanation deserves examination rather than automatic acceptance. It has not been examined with any rigor. It has largely been accepted as self-evidently reasonable. Here is what I keep returning to. If a distinct population, not giants in any mythological sense, but a population old enough and mobile enough to leave consistent traces across every major cartographic tradition, moved southward over many centuries, what would we expect the evidence to look like from the inside? We would expect exactly what we do find. Vivid, specific descriptions at the periphery, growing thinner and quieter as they approach the Southern Ocean. We would expect the furthest accessible human settlement, Patagonia, Tierra del Fuego, to mark the edge, and we would expect the territory beyond to be expensive, over-regulated, and inaccessible in ways that feel locally reasonable and are globally consistent. That structural coincidence, the evidence thinning exactly at the point where access becomes most controlled, is the thing I cannot set aside. Not because it proves anything, but because it is the kind of pattern that, in any other historical domain, would be considered significant enough to warrant more than institutional silence and a closed file. I want to be honest about where this leaves me. I have not resolved this question. I do not have a conclusion I trust. What I have is a pattern consistent enough to require a better explanation than it has received, and a set of institutions that are, for entirely local and locally reasonable motives, not providing one. There is something in the South that the historical record keeps gesturing toward, without naming. It may be nothing, a cascade of confirmation bias, a story assembled from material that does not actually connect. I have considered that seriously, and I cannot dismiss it. That uncertainty is real, and I will not paper over it with false confidence. But I also cannot dismiss the pattern itself, the southward drift of the record, the thinning of the evidence at the edge, the silence that greets every serious attempt to follow the line past the last documented human presence and into the ice. That silence does not feel like the silence of nothing being there. Somewhere under the ice, there is either nothing, in which case the silence is coincidence, and I have spent a long time reading shapes into noise, or there is something the record has been pointing toward for 5 centuries. I do not know which is true, and I am not sure anymore that I want to.